Live from the SABC's Auckland Park studios, welcome to this evening's episode of The Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvogo.
The 2021 NSC overall pass rate, including the progress learners, stands at 76.4%.
2021 Matric results, the highest in bachelor passes in the country's democratic history.
We are a system that has built the capacity to overcome adversity through resilience.
We go beyond the numbers and statements to interrogate what the results are actually telling us about the state of basic education in our country. We also speak to the system's most notable achievers about how they did it. All that and more in tonight's episode of The Watchdog, which starts right now. Basic Education Minister Nzi Mutshekga has announced that the 2021 National Senior Certificate overall pass rate, with the progressed learners included, stands at 76.4%. She says this is an improvement of 0.2 percentage points from the pass rate achieved by the class of 2020. She says the improvement comes despite the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic. The department earlier said the Matric class of 2021 was the largest ever. The Minister of Basic Education was, of course, also the first to acknowledge that there is still a very long way to go still.
We'll be the first to concede that challenges continue in our sector. To date, greater equity and redress still have to be systematically addressed. Inequalities still remain in the system. And it is worth mentioning that the poor funded schools, the provision of nutritious meal on a daily basis, and the provision of scholar transport to deserving learners on a daily basis. And these interventions, we can confirm that they have definitely improved access, they've improved retention, and are simultaneously promoting equity and quality immeasurably.
Well, tell us if you agree with the Minister on the statements that she made there, and of course all the things we're going to discuss over the next hour or so. The Twitter handles are on your screen at The Watchdog SABC, at Vuyo Mvogo. Earlier, Departmental DG Matanzima Mweli gave his technical report on what it took to bring about the 2021 Matric performance that has just been announced, and what it may all mean for the future of basic education in this country.
The NSC has become a very important barometer to tell us about whether we are succeeding or not in the sector. Number two, as I've already indicated, we use international and regional tests to gauge our performance. We've also now brought in the systemic evaluation to give us regular data and again, to give us the state of health of the system, to replace the annual national assessments that we used to carry out through ANA. Many of you would remember that. We also finalized the general education certificate, working with Umalusi, who plays a very important role as a quality assurer, in finalizing that qualification, which is going to afford us important data to make crucial decisions as learners and parents in terms of the pathway that learners are going to follow post grade 9, whether you go academic, whether you go occupational, or whether you go vocational.
Well, let's examine both the ministers and the DG's statements, as well, of course, as that technical report that the DG gave earlier about the state of health of the basic education system in our country. And to help us do that, Dr. Mlamuli Nkosipingile Hlachwayo, Curriculum and Education Studies, UKZN, and Professor Bram Fleisch, Education Leadership and Policy Studies Department at the University of Witwatersrand. Good evening, gentlemen, and thank you very much for your time this evening. If I may start with you, Dr. Mlamuli, just your overall comments, your observations, what you picked up from the pronouncements that were made this afternoon.
It's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag, but depending on how you look at it. I mean, it's still quite, we are still going through the pandemic, but it's been, 2 years, 3 years now, and it is not entirely clear to me whether the Ministry of Basic Education has entirely got their ducks in a row. You still see some of the really concerning rates, especially when you compare them with IEB in terms of the bachelor's rates. You still see some of the concerning pass rates when you see the higher certificate and the national diploma. We know about the dysfunctionality within the higher education system in the country, in particular the TVET sector, that is supposed to absorb a large number of these students. So it really doesn't seem like the Department of Basic Education has got their ducks in a row 2 years, 3 years into the pandemic, and woe unto the poor who really have to bear the burden. And I hope we'll get into that conversation a little bit later on the increasing gap between basic education and higher education, especially for these matriculants.
Okay. Professor Fleisch, apologies that the Zoom line couldn't hold. We'll have to do with, or make do with the telephone line. Your observations overall?
So I have some reservations about the ways in which the Minister and the DGs have suggested that the results do indicate some level of stability and resilience of the system. I think that if we had to do the same kind of benchmarking at grade 3, we'd see a very different picture. And I suspect that if that was the case, we will see quite a serious drop in the overall performance. Now, we know from the international comparative studies and our own systemic evaluations and some of the other work that's been done in the country that children, particularly young children, have been devastated by the pandemic and by the rotation system and by social isolation. And my worry is that taking the Matric results as an indicator of the relative robustness of the system can be very misleading.
Well, let's start with the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact or impact that it may have had in the results that we're seeing today, and of course more broadly on basic education in general. To quote the Minister, Dr. Hlachwayo, she says the class of 21 set for their 2021 National Senior Certificate examinations in, to quote her, a very hostile environment.
Well, she is correct to some extent, right? Because remember, it's this cohort that essentially, I think, if my dear brother Prof. Fleisch will correct me, these are the ones who went through, I think, grade 11, grade 12. So really, they've had a systematic and institutionalized education through the rotation system. And he's entirely correct. I mean, it's been nothing but a hostile condition. especially when you take into consideration that attending Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays for your maths, and then maybe next time you attend maths would be after 2 weeks or 3 weeks. That has devastating effects, not only for the curriculum content in terms of the learner's capacity and ability to understand and make sense of the content, but I think even deeper than that, Putvoyo, and this is where things like nutritious meals and others, where we know that a large number of our learners do depend on schooling to have access to those meals for socialization, for friendships and things like that. And that studying at home was never really viable for them if you add over and above the socioeconomic and structural conditions that Black working class households find themselves. So to call it either horrible or devastating or challenges is really an understatement. And really, they must be applauded, these learners, for what they went through. But I really expected a little bit better with the ministry, especially 2 years later into the pandemic, where things could now be done a little bit better.
Prof, I mean, you did mention earlier the rotation system, and I remember, I mean, over the past few days, in all the conversations that we've had so far, this matter has come up. Do you think, or from what you heard this afternoon from both the minister and the DG, do you get a sense now that the department now has a hold on this matter, and going forward, we're going to be able to manage things better?
I certainly hope so. I think the consensus, not just in South Africa but internationally, is that we need to be going back to teaching normal teaching. That's going to be a priority for 2022. And obviously we need to, as far as we can, ensure that protocols are observed. But the situation where children are going for 2 or possibly 3 days a week, that's certainly not going to provide children with the necessary time to master the key learning areas. And just to stress that I think that it has a particularly devastating effect on young children. So children in the grade R to 3 are the most severely negatively impacted by the rotational system. That's when children will be developing their ability to read and do mathematics. And the skipping of days often really sets them back considerably. They also don't have the capacity to use even limited amount of support that they could do at home. So I think that without really moving rapidly towards more conventional, traditional forms of daily attendance, I think we'll continue to see the erosion of learning taking place in the early grades.
I must say, I mean, when we're having these conversations over the past week, rotation system, you know, how generally the whole pandemic is being or has been managed, it was a bit absurd, I must say, for me. I battled to understand why, for example, the minister, from what the minister said, cabinet hadn't discussed, you know, what was going to happen from this year. One would have thought that with the reopenings of schools being a big item, on the government's agenda, this is something that would have been discussed. And by the time schools reopened, which started happening last week, and of course this week, yesterday, that those matters would have been cleared. But from what the minister said, and the department spokesperson, a ministry spokesperson also came on the program, was that this issue was yet to be discussed, which then suggested to me that the government doesn't seem to have the kind of hold we would have wanted it to have. 2 years down, down the road from the time we were hit by this pandemic. Dr. Hlachwa?
But it feels like that, doesn't it? That they don't have their ducks in a row, or it's an afterthought, especially when you see the countless amounts of studies, not only within early childhood development, but even if you look towards the grade 6, 7, and 8, as well as those who are in high school, just cognitively, the educational damage that has happened, the social and the socialization that has happened, the socio-economic devastation that has happened, and again, the socio-economic factors that I've outlined earlier, where black working class parents were told to buy data and smartphones and connectivity. I mean, these really are families and households that are relied on the 350 for daily subsistence and stuff. So, I mean, it doesn't really make sense, especially when you look at the global trend, particularly within the Europeans as well as the United States at the moment, where there is no scientific basis, at least that has been offered as yet, that has shown or indicated that schools have been promoting community spread of the virus. We haven't seen that as it. In fact, schools of all other places have been seen to be much more safer in terms of COVID-19. So I'm not entirely sure, but we understand where the rationale and the logic and the hesitance is coming from. 2 years ago, I would have been more sympathetic in terms of enough data was not available for this once in a lifetime pandemic. We're still trying to figure it out. We're waiting for the science to dictate the decision making. But we've got the data, we've got the science now, and schools by and large globally have been proven to be safe. So I'm not entirely sure I understand what the Ministry of Basic Education or the minister herself is thinking in terms of delaying this and continue with the devastating that the rotational learning is creating in the country.
Well, speaking of data and its ability or inability, to help, pupils as they were faced with this devastating pandemic over the past couple of years. Something that caught my attention, a comment made earlier, Professor Fleisch, by Professor Mary Metcalf, speaking to my colleague Matric ahead of the announcement of the results. Here's something that Professor Metcalf said.
Quintile 5 schools will have been able to study much more online last year and this year, because we must remember that the grade 12s of 2021 were in grade 11 in 2020 and they lost at least 3.5 months. It's a lot of time to lose.
You see, I mean, for the fairly, for children of parents who are better off financially, they may not have, one would have thought, I would think that they would not have been as affected as, children who are in your quintiles 1 and 2, for example, which then again takes us back to the issue of how the pandemic, actually widened the gap or really blew up the problems or the systemic problems our system like always had. And I guess the question we will have to answer now is what and how long it's going to take for our system, which the DG says is now more resilient, to actually close those gaps, because there are these unforeseen circumstances that come every now and again, as was the case with the pandemic, that simply, make the situation even worse than it was.
No, I think that's a very important insight, that we now have to address the challenge head on, that the inequalities that we had in our education system have gotten substantially worse. And it really requires us to do substantial new thinking. My worry often is that we think of the pandemic as having an impact on curriculum coverage, that the curriculum in grade 4 or grade 5, because there have been less days or less weeks in a year, we need to find a way to either catch up or streamline the curriculum. But the real challenge is not that. In my view, the real challenge is about realizing where the learning is at the moment and ensuring that we rethink our teaching to address where children's learning is and ensuring that the learning is actually addressed, not just the curriculum coverage.
From your vantage point, Dr. Hlachwa, would you agree with Professor Fleisch that the real challenge is in the teaching and not so much in the curriculum?
I think it's complex, but for you, I really think there is no single panacea or single diagnosis that we can offer at this point. I think the challenge is complex at this point. It's not just the content itself that cannot be covered adequately, whereby, remember, the rotational system suggests that and was implemented in such a way that depending, maybe, the grade 11s would attend on Mondays and Wednesdays. And maybe those would be the 2 days for maths, and then maths would be taught again maybe towards end of the month and others. So that has implications for curriculum delivery. That has implications for the pacing and the sequencing of the kind of topics that you want to cover, and to what extent and to what detail, and the critical engagement which is at the heart of this transformative education that a lot of us have been calling for. You cannot just transmit. You need to take your learners into the curriculum. You need to engage with them. You need to explain the outcomes, and you need to be a little bit patient in terms of repeating some of the things that may not have been understood. So that's one segment. I've mentioned the nutritional. I've mentioned the inequality aspect. I've mentioned the psychosocial aspects in terms of cognitive and learner development that has come as a result of actually not being at home and being forced, of not being at school rather, and being forced to be more at home and stuff. So really, the challenges that we are facing as a result specifically of this system are very complex. And I think it's something that the sector and the country in years to come would have to reckon with, because I don't think we fully appreciated the effects that our learners have gone through just these past 2 years.
Professor Fleisch, an aspect I'd like your comment on is, the minister works lyrical about what she calls the benefits of pro-poor policies of the government, and included therein was her comments. Both she and the DG spoke a lot about the performance of social grant recipients and candidates in correctional facilities.
So I think that you've got to see the long picture. There's no doubt over the last 25 years that significant policy interventions have had an impact on learners who come from quintile 1, 2, and 3 schools. With the school feeding programs, the scholar transport programs, and even the improvement of infrastructure and the sanitation programs have definitely benefited children from poorer communities. And we need to have a balanced perspective on it. There's no doubt that achievements have been made, and we need to applaud the department and the minister for spearheading those achievements, notwithstanding the fact that many of those achievements have been fought for by communities across South Africa. So I think there has been substantial gains, particularly in infrastructure and some resources for poorer communities. But ultimately, the real challenge is not about whether kids get better resources, but the real challenge is to what extent that we're narrowing the gap in learner achievement. And that's something that we don't really have sufficient evidence of, particularly at the early grade level. We don't know if we're actually getting better at getting more children to read at the age 10 than we did 10 years ago. And my concern is that while Anna clearly was a problem, we need to make sure that the systemic evaluation provides us with regular and rapid information about what's really going on in the learning outcomes for children, not just at the grade 12 level, and not even at the grade 9 level, but at the grade 3 level and the grade 6 level. Because ultimately, if you want to talk about reducing inequality, addressing the real challenges that are at the heart of South Africa, you have to look at learning outcomes, and you have to look at it over time and the extent to which gains are being made and whether we're actually reducing the inequalities in learning outcomes.
Very quickly, Professor Fleisch, I've got to release you. You've got to go. Dr. Hlachwa is staying with us. What, in your view, should top the minister's to-do list top 3 items if you were to advise her?
So in my view, the most important thing that we could do now is to measure learning outcomes in grade 3. The most important is measure learning outcomes in grade 3, not just in a sample of schools, but in all of our schools, because that will give us a very good picture about what the real impact of COVID has had and what the nature of inequality is in the system. So I think that it's going to be a big challenge. We have to work with our union partners, but it's absolutely critical that we get accurate and reliable information about learning outcomes, not just at grade 12 level, but particularly at the grade 3 level, where we know there are major gaps in our school system.
Okay, and that's where we're going to part with you, Prof. Of course, this conversation continues. The country's 2021 Matric results announced a couple of hours ago, and what we're doing this evening is speaking to people in the know to get a sense of what they think has happened, needs to happen. All of that, of course, on the back of reports given by both the Minister and the Director General of Basic Education earlier before the results were announced. This conversation continues after this short ad break when we will start with speaking to some of the people who have actually done well for the Matric 2021 class. That's coming up in a moment. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're talking about Matric results 2021 announced a couple of hours ago by the Minister of Basic Education, NG Motshekga. Now, the best performing province, if you haven't heard that yet, is the Free State. And right now we are joined from the Free State via the line by the head of department there to talk us through what they did to be able to achieve this particular result. Good evening, sir, and thank you very much for your time.
Good evening, Vuyo. Pete Makwe, I'm not the HOD, I'm the MEC.
Oh, sorry, MEC. My apologies.
Correct.
What did you do as a province to achieve this feat?
Well, we did literally what everybody is doing, in terms of working hard, motivating the learners, mobilizing the community to support education. I think the parents played a very big role because, as you know, that these 2 years were years where we had a huge problem of COVID, and we had to depend on parents to keep on supporting their learners, those who had access to things like online and so on, but also the teachers themselves. One thing that we did, maybe slightly different from other provinces in the Free State, was our schooling was going on for 7 days in a week, Monday to Sunday. And this we were doing because the grade 11s, the grade 12s of 2021 did not have full year for grade 11.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore we had to make sure that we close all those gaps of grade 11. And therefore we had to find a way of asking the parental support, the SGB support, and the teachers and their unions. I think they played a crucial role in supporting us. I think we have reached a stage where in the Free State, everybody, especially in the education sector, really want us to see us doing well. And that is through mobilization, because we have mobilized them. We've also mobilized social institutions like churches to say, we need to support these learners. On Sundays, you must always say something about education. When exam starts, we take them to various churches, and then we know that it does not necessarily improve their performance because of the prayer, but it actually motivates them to say you can work harder. And ministers of religion can quote scriptures and say, based on this scripture, you can also achieve. And I think that's social mobilization that we are doing in supporting the kids. These 2 years were extremely difficult. Yes.
Did it take any extra financial resources on the part of the provincial department?
Of course, indeed. We've had to, move money from one section to the other. You would have realized that, fortunately, there were not many meetings. People were not going overseas and all those kind of things. And we had to stop other programs to shift money to support the camps and extra work for the teachers. So indeed, yes, it was a very costly exercise, but it was worth it.
And MEC, earlier, my colleague, one of my colleagues, Matric Komane, spoke to the Professor Mary Metcalf, who was talking, about inequalities in and between provinces, and how even though we were going to, that was before the announcement of the results, even though we were going to, which we did, go through that ritual of saying, highest performing province and rate them accordingly all the way to the lowest performer. So saying there are, there's such inequality, in this country, that although that exercise is perhaps it's important to do that in sheer numbers terms, but in qualitative terms, this is something we have to perhaps examine a little bit more. I want you to take a listen to what Professor Metcalf had to say, and then you can comment on her remarks.
Let's just look at some of the detail of the difference in performance between quintile 5 schools and quintile 1 schools. So of the schools that are quintile 5, serving the wealthier communities, last year 82% of them got a pass rate that was between 80 and 100. For quintile 1 schools serving the poorer communities, it was only 35%. So we can immediately see that across the province, poorer school, 35% of schools got between 80 and 100. Wealthier communities is as much as 82 that got between 80 and 100. But there are huge differences between provinces. I would love us to focus on how provinces are doing relative to their circumstances. So let's take a province like KwaZulu-Natal, for example. KwaZulu-Natal is the largest education system provincially in this country. The number of learners that write from KZN is about 23%. So the quality of the pass that we get in KZN influences the whole national picture. But KZN has large areas that still carry the infrastructure challenges of the past. Circuit managers in KwaZulu-Natal need to move great distances between schools relative to a province such as Gauteng, which is compact. So the inequalities have to do with the historic inequalities in the socioeconomic status of families, the poverty of families, the backlog in terms of infrastructure, the funds that are available to support schooling.
MEC?
Yeah, I listened very carefully.
Well, what do you have to say? What do you have to say, especially the comments that you made in the latter part of that clip?
No, I can respond. You know, the issue of inequality and that exists in our country is there. I don't think anybody can dispute it. However, the issue is that how do you deal with the problem? And I think we're in a situation where we have to commit to solve the problems. Right? We can't be praising the problem. This is the phrase I always use for my teachers. We know that these kids are coming from poor families, for an example, in our province, but government has made an intervention that at least at 10 o'clock they'll be having a meal. And if you look at the history of how the intervention has been, you'd realize that before there was school feeding, especially at high school, there were very few learners and the performance was very, very bad. But since the advent of school feeding at school, the performance has improved. And I'm sure Professor Melkov spoke before she saw the results. Because if you look at the results now, they send a different story. The results are saying the quality passes from quintile 1 to 3. If you look at the bachelors as a university entrance, account 61% come from the quintile 1 to 3 schools, right? And then it shows that slowly but surely, the quintile 1 to 3, the so-called poor schools, are beginning to take shape. That people are beginning to take themselves serious. People are beginning to prioritize properly, right? In a province like the Free State, for an example, we before I don't want to, as if I'm praising myself, but
no, please do.
Before I became MEC of Education, there were very, very few township schools that are getting 100%. Today, when we talk, there's hundreds and hundreds of schools in our province that are achieving 100%. And then if you look at the poverty and equality that you're talking about, out of the 10 top districts, you'll find districts such as Harib, right? Extremely poor. It's there, but it's in the top 10 of the districts. They've outperformed some of the very rich districts in Gauteng. So I don't undermine the issue of inequality, but I think she must understand that this inequality is not static. Education is not static. There are many things that are happening to support education. There are many things that are happening to support the learner. The classes are getting smaller, learners are getting younger, and teachers are getting more serious. Right? One of the things that used to affect education a lot was the quality of teachers. Now, with today's teachers, are teachers who've got exemptions, for example, university entrance, who are fully more qualified. Yes, there are challenges sometimes where people complain that some of these teachers don't have experience, but experience will get it on the work.
Okay.
But if you look at attracting these young teachers, and make yourself a research lawyer, go to schools that are doing well. You'll see that majority of them, especially for subjects such as mathematics, accounting, business studies, economics, you'll realize that they are now manned by younger teachers who are much more qualified. And I can tell you that we are running a system on the rise.
Okay, I'll take that as an invite for me to come to the Free State and actually go to these high performers. But thank you very much for speaking to us this evening. And once again, congratulations on being the #1 province in the country. Mr. Pule Herbert Isaac Makwe, the MEC for Education in the province of the Free State. Well, let's go to the Eastern Cape now. The province achieved 73%, an improvement of 4.9% from 2020, which was or is the second highest improvement. And joining us now to discuss what they have done to achieve this feat is the head of Department of Basic Education in the Eastern Cape, and that's Dr. Naledi Mbude. Good evening, ma'am. Thanks very much for your time.
Good evening, Efuyo. Thank you.
What went into it? Luck, or did you put a great deal of concerted effort?
Certainly not luck. It was a strategy. The strategy was looking at our results of 2020. I work with numbers. Science helps me a lot because that's the only way that we can try to understand what did go wrong in the examinations of 2021. Remember, the Eastern Cape we have a big cohort, and unfortunately for the Eastern Cape, unlike provinces that are small like the Free State or the Western Cape, we always have. And last year, for 2021, we had 114 learners that were supposed to sit for the final examination. So we had to do things differently. So the most important thing was to go back and say, per school, not the Eastern Cape is underperforming, who in that school is underperforming. Because when you start doing that, then you say, the only way you can assist somebody is to say, Vuyo, you're underperforming, because for the past 3. So we did a 3-year analysis per teacher, per school, per subject, per principal, per circuit manager, so that the accountability chain goes up. So we did roadshow. I personally went to the 12 districts of the province to say, this is what you look like. Now, you've been doing this for 3 years. Either you have slumped because of COVID in 2020, or you've been doing this, whether there was COVID or not. So we started to see this upsurge, particularly in September, because now people knew that we are looking at the person, and also not only looking, but supporting whatever area of need that person is lacking in. So it's a strategy that has worked. Not only that, but we built on the work that has happened before in the province, because in 2019 we were already at 78%. So there were foundations that were laid by the previous heads of department and MECs, and all we had to do this year was to ensure that we go back to that and say, how can we reboot that?
And what were the levels of cooperation from these people, especially, your teachers and, of course, the administrators? There's often tensions there.
2021 was a difficult year for the Eastern Cape. We lost our head of department in January. Before we opened, we lost him. And this is a man that all of us, he saw the system rising. He made sure that the system is stable. And so it was a difficult thing getting into his shoes. I knew I had a tough job. And unlike him, he finds a way to engage people. And I think this is his strength. And I do not have that strength like him. I had to come with something different. And mine was to use science to explain and to look at the numbers, and qualitatively, not just the quantity, but also what quality tells us in terms of the performance. So I was amazed, because in terms of the South African Schools Act, those schools who are performing below the benchmark of 65%, I have a responsibility as an accounting officer to hold them to account and to make sure that they move up. So I made them my project. The reason that they were so accepting and they saw this as important is because I didn't do that, and the system didn't do that to ridicule, but to show them that this is exactly where you are at. How do we help you?
And that's how they understood it as well.
Definitely. And this is why we had people responding, because it was help to them.
And I mean, you are also the province with a reputation of having some of the worst infrastructure, of course, being largely rural. Those challenges, add to the burden. Where is that? Is there an improvement? Is the situation getting any better?
Look, we delivered 11 new schools just in the last month, because in terms of our infrastructure, historically we've been very bad in that, because we have mud schools in the Eastern Cape, particularly on the side of across the Khai, but also the improvement and the number of new schools that we have opened in the province have uplifted the spirits of our people. But also the fact that we have now disasters, we still have schools that are resembling our past. But because of the budget that we operate in the Eastern Cape, from our equitable share of the province, the department does not get from that because of the reduced resources of the province. We depend on the infrastructure grant that we get from the DBE. But because we have been using that grant to ensure where we can, we go and plug those holes. But there are always going to be those holes as long as we have disasters now. as we are finishing projects, 97 schools go down in the disaster, severely affected. So as one of the things that characterize the Eastern Cape is the resilience of our people. Because of the levels of poverty and understanding that the only thing that will take them out of that poverty is education. That's the spirit of the people of the Eastern Cape. And we want to say we are going to make sure that we do our part, but the fact that they know that everything that they do will improve what is currently has been happening for many years. The small transformation improvements that we have in the system, people appreciate that.
Well, we can only hope that you'll do more of what you did to achieve this feat, and that spirit of the people of the Eastern Cape also comes in abundance, and we look forward to seeing you being the number one province in the country. Dr. Naledi Mbude, who is the HOD of education in the Eastern Cape, they have achieved a 73% result, an improvement of 4.9% from 2020, the second highest improvement in the country. Dr. Tlhatshwayo, I'm just listening to both the HOD and the MEC earlier. Just your thoughts or what you were able to pick up.
I think it's encouraging, and I'm glad that I think it's the head of department for the Eastern Cape, who's there in studio with you, who is offering responding quite well to the challenge that Prof. Mary outlined for us, and how it doesn't really serve us well to have this very inter-provincial competition where we ignore the structural differences between the Western Cape and, say, Northern Cape, between Northwest and, say, maybe Mpumalanga. So I'm very glad that my colleague over there in students began to do something a little bit different for the Eastern Cape by offering a much more specific and a targeted approach to checking the underperformance in terms of seeing what the school is going through, what were the marks for the school, whether its challenges or have been prior performance, and how can the school improve in future. I think really that's a brilliant model, if you ask me, Putvoyo, and I think that's the model for the future personally, because I think it's way more useful, it's way more better. I'm not, of course, suggesting that there's nothing exciting and quite jovial about the competition that we've created between the Free State and the Western Cape and Gauteng provinces, and who will top each other. But I'm gradually appreciating what my colleague over there has offered in terms of much more specific and targeted systemic solutions towards inside the province itself, targeting and looking at these schools specifically, the schools that were struggling the past 2-3 years. Are we seeing any growth? Are we seeing any progress? Because for me, that's really where the solutions lie. Because we can find out that the province as a whole has had a 2% or 3% improvement, but those quintile 1, 2, 3 schools that do need quite systemic interventions, how are they best supported? So I'm actually in love with that model, and I'm deeply appreciative to my colleague there in the Eastern Cape that they are beginning to think a little bit much more creatively around targeting specific schools and coming up with those context-specific solutions.
Okay, very, very briefly, Dr. Tlhatshwayo, same question I asked Professor Fleisch earlier. 3 items that should top the minister's to-do list this year.
Oh, that's a very difficult one. If you're referring to the Minister of Basic Education, absolutely. I think there's a need to rethink with immediate effect the rotational system within basic education. I think it's been much more devastating. And I think with Professor Fleisch, we've outlined those psychosocial, the economic, the psychological, the personal, and others. I think that has been absolutely devastating for us in particular. The second one, I think it's much more curriculum. I think it's much more content, and I think that's in result in terms of the suspensive learning and the learning content and the teachers as well being able to cover the content. I know the 2 years, the 3 years have been absolutely damaging for the sector, but I think we need to relook at the curriculum within basic education, specifically grade 10, grade 11, and grade 12, and trying to see to what extent it's responding to the bridge, that never-ending bridge between basic education and higher education. And my third solution, this is really, is not just targeted to the Minister of Basic Education, but it's my hope that together with the Minister of Higher Education, there begins much more coherence between both the basic education and the higher education departments. At the moment, they don't seem to talk to each other. And I think a better coherence, relationship, and a conversation between the two ministries will go a long way, because we will be absorbing millions of these matric learners into the system, and we need to come up with a better and a systemic way of trying to absorb these numbers without disadvantaging more, without some of them experiencing financial exclusion, without some of them experiencing cultural exclusion, and without some of them being alienated by curriculum and then dropping out within the first 2 years and things like that. So really, those are my three pressing solutions if I was lucky enough to advise the minister.
Okay, that's why I'm going to leave it with you. Thank you very much for honoring us with your presence, Dr. Hlatshwayo, this evening. Of course, I mean, there are those who didn't do well in these exams, and the message from the minister, the DG, all stakeholders, including us, here at the SABC, is that you should not despair. There are several opportunities that have been created that are part of the system. Whether you want to improve your results or whether you want to enroll again and get a second chance, there are numerous opportunities to do so. And we'll examine those over the next few days on this program, but also on our sister programs. And the SABC will also launch the hashtag Matric campaign aimed at offering support to learners that were not successful in passing their matric this time around. Listen to SABC board chairperson Bongo Musa Makatini saying something about this earlier on before the results were announced.
We recognize that not all learners have succeeded in matriculating today. For this reason, the SABC will launch a campaign called #MatricCentric, aimed at guiding matriculants as they navigate life after high school, while equally providing support to those who will rewrite their matric exams. Ladies and gentlemen, these other educational interventions demonstrate our commitment to ensure that the SABC fulfills its mandate in delivering content that cultivates learning and restores dignity of South African citizens.
And that's your public service program, the Watchdog, for this evening. To join us again tomorrow evening, 8 p.m. sharp. Good night.